This video was brought to you by Incogni. On Monday, French President Emmanuel Macron caused quite a stir when, at a late-night news conference after a special European summit focused on Ukraine, he apparently suggested deploying Western troops against Russia. Now, Macron's comments have been overstated by parts of the media, and it's worth making clear that Macron didn't explicitly advocate for deploying troops on the ground, but rather refused to actively rule the idea out, in order to create what he himself described as strategic ambiguity. For context, strategic ambiguity is a term usually used to describe America's long-standing policy towards Taiwan, and it essentially involves creating uncertainty about your position to deter the other side from escalating, whilst also avoiding active provocation. Anyway, Macron's comments went down like a lead balloon, not just with the Kremlin, who warned that active Western involvement in Ukraine would make direct conflict between Russia and NATO, quote, inevitable, but also most of Ukraine's allies. The White House promptly declared it would not send troops before Britain, Italy, Spain, Poland, Czechia, and NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg all quickly followed suit. But perhaps the most explicit condemnation of the idea came from German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who, almost immediately after Macron's comments, put out a statement on Twitter saying, "It is clear there will be no ground troops from European countries or NATO." A few hours later, Scholz pushed back even harder, saying that there was, quote, unanimous agreement amongst European leaders that troops wouldn't be sent to Ukraine, and that this had been agreed from the beginning. This is just the latest in a growing series of disagreements between France and Germany, and while Scholz's sentiment is clearly shared by most of NATO, the tone of his response is a symptom of the current dysfunction in the Franco-German relationship. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the widening gulf between France and Germany over Ukraine, the other issues currently straining the relationship, and how this falling out might change the balance of power within Europe. So, as we've just mentioned, Scholz clearly doesn't like Macron's policy of strategic ambiguity, in part because Scholz is just more wary of escalation than Macron is, but that's not the only thing the two disagree about. In fact, as we see it, there are at least 3 other Ukraine-related disagreements between them. First, there's the issue of Germany's Taurus missiles, which are long-range, bunker-busting cruise missiles that Ukraine wants to be able to strike targets deep behind Russia's front lines. Scholz has so far refused to hand them over on the grounds that the Taurus's range of 500 kilometers means Ukraine would be able to strike Moscow, which could be provocative, and that, in order for Germany to exercise control, i.e. prevent Ukraine from striking places like Moscow, actually using the Taurus missiles on Ukrainian soil would probably require German troops on the ground. Anyway, Scholz's reluctance on this front has sparked some irritation, not just from Ukraine but also from Macron, who delivered the French equivalent, the Scalp missile, to Ukraine last year. Although it's worth saying that Taurus has greater range and sophistication than the Scalp missile. Macron seemed to tacitly mock Germany's position on this in Monday's press conference, saying, "Many of those saying never today are the same people who said never tanks, never, never planes 2 years ago. 2 years ago, many around this table said, we'll offer sleeping bags and helmets." On top of Taurus, France and Germany have 2 other Ukraine-related disputes, which both tie into wider, long-standing disagreements. The first is over funding. Essentially, Macron wants the EU to fund its support for Ukraine via so-called defence bonds, issued by the EU. In other words, by borrowing money at the EU level rather than at the national level. This was a plan first floated by Estonia earlier this month, but it's not gone down well in Berlin, both because Germany is generally more wary of debt sharing, but also because one of the current German coalition members, the neoliberal FDP, have responded to their declining poll numbers by trying to reassert their fiscally conservative credentials, i.e. by vetoing further spending at the national level and further debt sharing at the EU level. This speaks to a wider disagreement between France and Germany on the issue of debt sharing. The French have always been more open to debt sharing than the Germans, but this divide has widened in the past few years, because at the same time as the German government, or specifically the FDP, has become less keen on the idea, the French, or specifically Macron, have become more keen on it. Since the pandemic, Macron has frequently called for more debt sharing, and only last month he called for Eurobonds to fund, quote, major priorities for the future. Macron's reasoning here is that the EU needs more fiscal space, i.e. the ability to borrow more money to afford both the energy transition and greater military spending. And given that most EU members don't have that much fiscal space, this can only be achieved across the EU via debt sharing. The third and final Ukraine-related dispute is over the extent to which Europe should focus its new defence spending on developing its domestic industry. Essentially, Macron has just argued that, instead of buying weapons from places like the US, Europe should spend its new defence budgets developing its own arms industry. both because this guarantees Europe a degree of strategic independence and because it's more sustainable. Last year, for example, Ukraine basically bought something like 500,000 artillery shells from South Korean stockpiles, more than all of Europe combined. Unfortunately, without a European industry to continue the supply, this represented an unsustainable one-off infusion, and Ukraine is now running out of ammo because the EU has fallen drastically short of its own production targets. Again, this speaks to a wider disagreement between France and Germany over the question of protectionism and free trade. France has always been keener on protectionism, i.e. using the state to protect and develop certain domestic industries, than Germany. But this debate has widened recently, largely because Macron believes that Europe needs to more actively protect its own industry in the face of what he sees as unfair trade practices from both the US and China. So what does this spat mean for the rest of Europe? Well, the collapse of the Franco-German engine has opened up the political space for new intra-EU grouping to lead the EU, like the Weimar Triangle. But Franco-German disagreements over security also open up the political space for greater defence cooperation between France and the UK, especially if, as expected, Keir Starmer takes power in Britain. Late last year, Starmer came out in favour of some sort of defence pact with the EU, separate from the pre-existing trade and cooperation agreement. In a sense, this would be a return to the early 2000s, when France and the UK, then led by Jacques Chirac and Tony Blair, took the lead on a budding European security policy, largely because they didn't think Germany was a credible actor on defence issues. Clearly, the current state of this world is being plagued by uncertainty and risk, and while you've been watching this video about France and Germany, your personal information may have been sold or published online without you even knowing it. Even whilst recording videos, we're interrupted by robocalls, and if you're wondering why you also may be getting random numbers calling your phone, well, the answer is the malevolent working of shady forces, called data brokers. These data brokers can collect and sell your personal information to anyone, from a company to an online criminal. This data can include your name and aliases, social security number, login credentials, home address, location history, online activity, and much more. But even if you're not fussed about a call here and there, one day it could be a little call, but the next day a huge loan could be taken out under your name. So if you want to protect your data, Incogni is here to help. Incogni reaches out to data brokers on your behalf, requests your personal data removal, and deals with any objections from their side. Since many data brokers continue collecting your personal information even after they've removed it, Incogni also takes care that your data stays off the market by conducting repeated removal requests. So create an account with our link in the description, grant Incogni the ability to work on your behalf, and sit back as they make you safer. Plus, by using our link, you'll get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan. Thanks for checking it out, and thanks to Incogni for sponsoring this video.